first speaker on this poverty and social exclusion panel is Davin Roche, who's Director of Workplace Diversity and of Community Development in Glen. He has a very, I think probably actually since he was a child, a very little boy, he has been active in community organisations and community development of one kind or another. I'm right about that, Davin, aren't I? And before he joined Glen, he was working, for example, with the Citizens Information Board on national disability advocacy. He was also coordinator of the Brain Drugs Task Force, something I didn't actually know about Davin. And he was also a social worker with travellers with Fingal County Council, among many other interesting and always community-focused occupations. In Glen, as I said, he's their workplace, one of their diversity champions. He is the director of the Diversity Champions Workplace Equality Programme, which I'm telling you knocks them down dead every time they hear it. And he has worked with, obviously, a range of LGBT community development and social inclusion bodies, including the LGBT Diversity Steering Group, where we are very good colleagues, and I hope are productive, I think productive as well. And he's also worked with the National Economic and Social Council, the Office for Social Inclusion, and the Department of Community, Rural and Gaeltacht Affairs. So he is extremely experienced indeed, and is going to talk to us this morning about social inclusion policy and ask the question, does it deliver for LGBT people, and perhaps even for which LGBT people does it deliver most, and for whom perhaps very little. So you're very welcome, Davin.
Thank Dublin City Council for giving us, I'm not sure if they're giving us or paying, or we're paying first, but giving us, I'm sure, and it shouldn't go there. This wonderful room, and I really enjoy being in this wonderful room every time I'm here. As you probably guessed, these are the Dublin City walls, the ancient historic city walls, and I always get a bit of fun out. They had to take them down, as you probably guessed, when they were building Woodquay, and put it back up again, and they numbered each stone, and I can never quite work out from the numbering how they managed. So what I wanted to do, and you've heard a bit about me, I work with Glen, the Gay and Lesbian Equality Network, and Glen's vision is to achieve full equality for lesbian, gay, bisexual people. We work across a range of areas, including education, mental health, sexual health, legislative reform, workplace diversity, community development, a whole range of areas. And I guess we've been working hard, I suppose, over the last number of years, specifically on poverty and social exclusion within the LGBT community primarily, but latterly we are beginning to work on LGBT anti issues. And I wanted really just to share some of our experiences with you in terms of both the successes and the challenges in trying to address poverty and social exclusion with you. And I think there's some maybe interesting lessons on that. So really, where we kind of begin is this document that some people might have come across, Poverty, Lesbians and Gay Men, which was published way back in 1995, about 18 years ago. And at the time it was a seminal document in terms of the Combat Poverty Agency, formal organ of the state, working on addressing poverty, engaging specifically on LGB as it was issues then. This was 2 years after decriminalisation. It took 5 years of working with the agency to get them to agree to engage in a poverty study, because it was a hugely risky for LGBT people, because it was a hugely risky time, a very difficult time, and there was huge credit to Hugh Fraser and his colleagues in the CPA for taking it on. It's obviously 18 years old, but it sets a nice framework for understanding poverty and social exclusion in an LGBT context. And it might be useful just to define poverty and social exclusion in an Irish context. And the NESC and the Partnership 2000 document define social exclusion as cumulative marginalisation from 5 key areas: from income, from employment, from decision making, from quality of life, and from social and community family networks. And it's a very interesting model and framework to actually define, well, what does social exclusion mean? So the study was, it's really still a unique study internationally in terms of looking at poverty amongst LGBT people. There are very few examples of it internationally, and it is very noteworthy in that respect. So what did it find? It surveyed about 159, I think it was, LGBT individuals, and the findings found that 21% of those surveyed were in poverty, using a 70% of median income figure, which compared to about 15% of the general population. In terms of unemployment, it didn't find a specific causal link between sexual orientation and employment or unemployment, but it documented some of the very real difficult experiences that people have around discrimination and harassment. And so very high figures of people resigning or being dismissed because of either an anti-gay culture within an organisation or explicit homophobia. And it talked about people self-selecting out of careers because of their concerns about their own safety in those careers. Decision making it didn't touch on. In terms of quality of life, it had a huge wealth of documenting the very difficult experiences that many LGBT people experienced around educational disadvantage, about leaving school early, about bullying and harassment, the huge impact of homophobia on mental health, which was clearly documented. Accommodation exclusion in terms of homelessness, people being kicked out of home. Also in terms of tenure of people actually buying houses, there was a whole sense that LGBT people, because of discrimination in the context of insurance industry, the HIV crisis that was there at the time, the crossover between where you lived and your personal safety and being rooted in terms of home ownership, were huge experiences of exclusion. Services, this was pre the equal status legislation and the employment equality legislation, and it's interesting reading the report how respondents were very much pushing and hoping for some protection within that context, which we clearly have now. Violence came out very strongly within the research. And in terms of networks, the difficulties that people have in terms of meeting people, in terms of isolation, in terms of exclusion from their own families and their communities were very strong, very clearly documented. And in some ways, this is certainly for our work in Glen, even though this is 1993, it's very much set a context for the work that we try to do in terms of addressing both individual and specific aspects of social exclusion. Be it poverty related in terms of income, employment related issues, decision making, the political system both locally and nationally, a whole range of quality of life issues and community development and social network aspects. So that was 93, and things of our understanding of poverty and social exclusion for LGBT people has obviously developed and grown, and more significant has been work has been done on specific areas over the years. So in 2013, I suppose some of the additional aspects that weren't covered in that, which we have a stronger understanding of, are differences in lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender experiences within the workplace and in terms of poverty, and Broden touched in particular on some of the very really worrying figures around trans unemployment and trans marginalisation from the workforce. In terms of local and national representation, there's been significant developments I suppose at a national level. Fine Gael have an LGBT caucus, Labour have an LGBT caucus. We've seen engagement by community organisations locally and regionally with their local authorities to get local authorities through their planning processes and working on LGBT issues. We've seen huge variation regionally. We've seen great progress in certain areas and little or no progress in others. In terms of quality of life, as we know, a whole range of issues around gender recognition and a whole range of issues which you can see there. And the urban and rural experience is something that has really come to the fore, I think, through programmes like LGBT diversity and elsewhere. So just some of the experiences and the challenges of working on poverty, LGBT poverty in the Irish context. One of the things that we haven't been able to do is to show or to describe whether you're at greater risk of being poor in statistical terms because of your LGBT identity. The Combat Poverty research worked on the premise that if you suffer harassment, discrimination in work, in where you live, the impacts it will have on health, educational attainment, logically there has to be a relationship between education disadvantage, health issues, and having an impact on participation in the workforce and poverty. However, the sample size was just too small to actually conclusively say that the link was very, very evidently there. It certainly felt like it was there, intuitively it's there, but in terms of having a solid research base that we could then go to government departments, it wasn't there to the extent that it is there for women, for people with disabilities, for a whole range of other groups which are named in anti-poverty strategies. The lack of census data is a real difficulty. There's census data for every other group experiencing poverty. There isn't for LGBT or T people. Ireland is not alone in that. I'm not aware of any national census which has a question specifically on sexual orientation and gender identity. But that causes a real problem in trying to make the case to policymakers around getting LGBT poverty on poverty agendas. There's another area around, does LGBT identity give some protection against experiences of poverty? And again, there's not solid statistical evidence around it, but clearly one of the big risk factors in poverty in Ireland is being a parent and having children. And there's some insulation for lesbian, gay, bisexual people in terms of not having kids in the same numbers that the general population has around a route into poverty. There's also access to other social networks that being LGBT brings to you in terms of having a social capital that many other poorer people may not have. Again, there's no strong, conclusive evidence around these issues. They're more themes. So what did that mean in terms of getting the state to address LGBT poverty? And I just wanted to share some of our experiences in getting the state and trying to get the state to, as I say, recognise LGBT poverty and address it. People may be familiar with the National Anti-Poverty and Social Inclusion Strategy, which was the big policy instrument in the 90s to address poverty. Not sure if anyone's gone through it to look for the references to LGBT poverty. Has anyone can share any of what it says about LGBT poverty with us? I'm glad you can't, because I certainly can't, because there's absolutely nothing within the National Anti-Poverty Strategy about lesbian, gay experiences of poverty. It's simply not there, it doesn't exist. And clearly we in Glen made a number of submissions highlighting the work from the Combat Poverty report, the specific experiences of poverty and social exclusion. And what we were told was by the Office for Social Inclusion, which had the lead role around NAPS, was we're not really that interested in social exclusion here, we're more interested in poverty. And the text was, you haven't established that LGBT people are poor, therefore this strategy isn't for you. NAPS didn't deliver at all. And I think that poses a fundamental question in terms of how do we name and address LGBT poverty in an Irish context. The poverty instrument has not addressed it. There have been community portraits where the Office for Social Inclusion has talked about women's experiences, people with disabilities experiences of poverty, but despite repeated requests to have a dedicated LGBT portrait of poverty, no progress has been made on that. The equality framework clearly has been much more useful for addressing LGBT experiences of poverty and social exclusion, and the two fundamental pieces of legislation, it's very heartwarming when reading the very negative experiences in '93 and the huge demand that was being asked by LGBT people for protection in law. To see that that is there now. Broden referred to Louise Hannon's a wonderful case, albeit a limited, one of the very few, if only, trans employment cases, but still hugely significant. The life cycle framework is another framework which came out of the developmental welfare state, again by NESC, and it was a shift from a poverty framework to looking at a framework which attempted to define the life cycle experiences for young people, for families, for older people, for people with disabilities. It was critiqued by a lot of anti-poverty workers and activists because it was, the concern was it downplayed income and poverty and focused more on broad issues which did not specifically talk about poverty and address poverty. But interestingly, from an LGBT perspective, it's the first time in a significant policy document of this scale that we do see LGBT references specifically covered. So when it talks about young people, it talks about LGBT young people's experiences. When it talks about families, it talks about the lack of legislative protection for LGBT families. It talks about the specific examples of older LGBT people. So it's a very interesting report. It's one which we made submissions to, and our submissions were taken on board, unlike the anti-poverty strategy, which is interesting. Community development is both an activity, but also a statutorily funded activity which is fundamentally concerned with equality, equality, anti-poverty, and social exclusion. And it has, thank you, Albert, 5 minutes, I still have 5 minutes. There have been really significant examples within community development of supporting LGBT communities. And many of the people here in the room and speaking today will talk with a great richness around work that has been done in terms of, well, a whole range of areas. And a number of organisations here, along with Glenn, made a submission to the Community Development Programme, I'm not sure how many years ago now, for dedicated LGBT community organisations. And because the National Anti-Poverty Strategy made no reference to LGBT people, this was then used as a reason not to fund LGBT organisations in the Community Development Programme, which was a huge missed opportunity. Hubble, who manage, if that's the right term, the local and community development program, the partnerships and so forth, did break this link between defining social exclusion only in terms of poverty, and clearly described that people can experience social exclusion without specifically being in poverty, which opened up the programme to engaging on LGBT issues, both within poor communities, but also right throughout the communities that they work with, and I think that's been very significant in terms of partnerships working on LGBT inclusion. In terms of alternative frameworks, I suppose where we've seen real progress from a policy perspective is in terms of very specific issues, in terms of education, mental health, a whole range of issues. And the question is, has the poverty and social inclusion policy framework led to progress within these areas? I would think the poverty framework hasn't in terms of a policy context. The social exclusion one certainly has. The quality of life issues, the exclusion from family and social networks, employment issues in terms of equality in the workplace. So the social exclusion framework has very much been a narrative that has supported specific work in these areas. But in education, issues have been around, particularly around bullying and harassment, safety for LGBT individuals, and we've seen, for just as one example, significant progress recently in terms of the work, the bullying report and strategy from the Department of Education, which belonged to, and Glenn and others were involved in. But essentially we're seeing a whole range of other frameworks in terms of equality, in terms of health, in terms of safety, supporting that progress. So by way of concluding, poverty and social exclusion policy in Ireland cannot deliver for LGBT people. I suppose what we've seen is we've seen really limited progress under the poverty framework. What the CPA report showed, that LGBT people who are poor their experience of poverty and social exclusion can be hugely exacerbated by the discrimination and harassment that they experience in those other elements of the model. But we haven't succeeded in terms of communicating to the state that LGBT people are at greater risk of poverty because of their identity. The social exclusion framework has been very significant in terms of all the areas that I covered. So can it deliver for LGBT people? I'll leave that open to yourselves now. Having said all that. Thank you.